Hi, everyone.
Oh, we might want to wait just a second.
Okay.
It's still encoding, I think. Okay, I think it's going.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Blaylock, and you already met my colleague Micah Bateman last week. We'd like to welcome you to our second live breakout session for our Every Atom Women MOOC course. I'd just like to start off by saying a few words about my own work on Whitman. I have a PhD in 19th century American Lit, and I write on one of Walt Whitman's favorite hangouts in New York City. In the years before the Civil War, he spent a lot of time hanging out at Pfaff's Beer Cellar, located on Broadway. Pfaff's is where he met a group of men and women, actors, artists, and writers, who call themselves the first American Bohemians. And I'm interested in Whitman's interactions with the Bohemians in that community and how that interaction impacted his poetry, and also in the history of Pfaff's restaurant and its owner. I work on Whitman's fiction primarily right now. That's my most recent project. Some of you might know that Whitman wrote short stories in the 1840s, most of which were published in a prestigious literary journal for the time, the Democratic Review. I've written an article for the Walt Whitman Quarterly on that, and I am interested in the reprinting and circulation of Whitman's fiction, so where he was being published at home and abroad. And if any of you have questions about Whitman's fiction or about Pfaff's, I'm happy to take those today, in addition, of course, to talking about the sessions on democratic poetry and the sections of Song of Myself that we were reading for today. So the breakout session today is going to cover our two course sessions from this week on main characters and democracy. And I'm going to just start with a brief recap of those two sessions from the week. The first session was on main characters, and in this session you'll recall that Ed Folsom and Chris Merrill talked about the I and the you, the poetic persona, the I, that is made of the same atoms as the reader, and the you, that singular and plural pronoun that is always a single reader and every reader of the poem simultaneously. At different times, it seems to become the soul, the grass, and what that pronoun is referring to seems to shift throughout the poem. The topic of the second session for the week were the broad concepts of democracy and Whitman's imagination of what that democratic process, always a work in progress for Whitman, would have looked like in Song of Myself. And we talked a good deal about his expansive and inclusive cataloging. We've seen a lot of action on the discussion forums, particularly related to the catalogs. Some people writing their own catalogs, experimenting with poetry themselves. And we also talked a good deal in the sessions and on the discussion board about some challenges that democratic ideal that Whitman put forth faced, like the Civil War, the nation divided, those things that troubled Whitman's vision of a unified and democratic America.
Great, so I think I'm just going to go ahead and start taking questions from the session page. So if you have questions as we go along, put them up on the session page, and I'll be refreshing my browser, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. I think we're going to start with one of the more general questions, and certainly one that's sort of encapsulating of things we were talking about this week. C. Belia writes, "There's a lot of talk about democracy. I'm not clear on the meaning of the term, especially as used by Professor Folsom and Professor Merrill. Is there a clear and succinct definition of the term?"
That's a really great question, and I'm not sure that this is going to be a clear, succinct definition of the term, but I'm gonna make an effort to take on this, because I feel like this is a broad question for a really broad topic for Whitman. For Whitman, one of the things that I saw that was most interesting in the discussion forums that seems to speak to Whitman's idea of democracy was this idea of how, at one point, we talked about how the grass might mean compassion, and that really struck me in the forums, because I think compassion is a large part of Whitman's democratic ideal. Whitman seems to have drawn some of that, or he seems to have gotten some of that compassion or empathy maybe from some 19th century reform movements. I'm thinking of the temperance movement. When I think of Whitman and democracy, I think of his efforts to incorporate a lot of voices, his efforts not to condemn different individuals, but his efforts to really be inclusive of all voices. And one of the places that comes up, I think, getting back to the temperance movement that I started with, is Whitman was really interested in the Washingtonian temperance movement. And what was different about that from other temperance movements is that the Washingtonians really emphasized compassion and brotherhood, reaching out to individuals who drank too much alcohol. Whereas some of the previous movements, such as that were run by ministers, would have condemned those people. This movement preached really reaching out, helping them, helping to give them a hand up and to come back into the nation, into that model of the nation where they're becoming productive citizens. Okay, so I think that's one way in which Whitman sees democracy. I think, of course, there's the modern sense of the term, the idea that all the eligible citizens in a government are participating in that. They're either directly or indirectly related in the process of making, incorporated in the process of making laws. And I think that comes up in Whitman as well, but I think he's doing that on a level of bringing in all these voices. I think that's what's most important for him.
Cool. Here's one from Subhadeep. Hi, Stephanie. What do you think of Whitman's conception of international poetry? He is international, but each time his word speaks of America, its land, its streets, its people. How does he manage to be open to the wide world, yet remaining in his roots? What's your opinion on his sort of relationship to international poetry? Blake talked a little bit last week about some of the sort of more radical poets in France at the time, being Baudelaire or Rimbaud. What's your take?
Well, when I was reading this, I was taking, I took the question to mean the ways in which Whitman sort of makes Song of Myself an international poem, where he intends to incorporate international voices into this poem. And I think one of the things that I noticed is that when I was teaching Song of Myself during my experience in Germany, when I taught at TU Dortmund University the last couple of years, my students often said, they would read this poem, they would say, this poem is about America. It's entirely about America. It's American nationalism. Where's the room for, anything outside of America? And when it comes to writing an international poem, I think Whitman would have seen the America that he was writing in as an international place. He would have seen this as an international poem because the America he was talking about was already always international. If we think about the immigration movements, people from Germany, Ireland, France, that Whitman would have encountered on the streets of New York when he was crossing Brooklyn Ferry, for him, these people were a part of the America. They were a part of his everyday city in New York that he would have experienced. He loved words in other languages. Sometimes we'll see his words from French coming up in his poems. So we get the sense that he made an effort to incorporate words from other languages, that they were that these international peoples were a part of his everyday experience. He also, I think Whitman was also writing from a particular place. He was not someone who had traveled abroad, so he would have to have gotten his information from the people around him. So he would have talked to people on the omnibus. He would have talked to people on the ferry. He also talked to people at Pfaff's beer cellar itself. And this would not have, of course, been applicable to the first edition. I mean, he was writing the first version of what would become Song of Myself in 1855. But in the 1860s, when Whitman was going to Pfaff's beer cellar, and this was certainly before, the 1881 edition that we're reading for this course, even though he'd not traveled to Europe, he was encountering a lot of people who had. So he was sitting around the barroom table talking with the editor, Henry Clapp, who had lived in France for a while. He was in a place owned by Charles Pfaff, a German immigrant who had lived in Switzerland. So he's encountering all of these people in all of these places. And I feel like this was a part of his everyday America. This was a part of his everyday life. So for him, when he's thinking about international poetry, I can't help but think that he was already thinking about these international influences in America itself.
So who were some of the other interesting figures who would have been in Pfaff's with him at the time?
Well, there are any number of really interesting people at Pfaff's. In addition to Charles Pfaff, the owner, who has his own interesting history coming from, being born in Germany and then being a waiter in Switzerland for a long time before coming to the U.S. He would have also met a number of writers, artists, actors. He would have known female actresses like Ada Clare and Ada Isaacs Menken in New York. Menken was famous for playing a lot of male roles, for dressing in male costume frequently. He would have known poets. He would have known illustrators. There was Henry Clapp. He was the kind of a leader of the group. He was the editor of the New York Saturday Press, and Henry Clapp printed Whitman's poetry in the New York Saturday Press newspaper. He printed parodies of Whitman's poetry. He kind of thought that there was, no bad publicity if people were parodying and making fun of your poetry. It's still all publicity, right? It's still getting your name out there. So he would have known any number of really interesting figures at Pfaff's.
Cool. So we'll take another question from Jay Burek. Let me see. She writes, "Perhaps this will only reveal I failed to complete some reading or otherwise attend to Whitman's biography. But as I was looking through the catalogs in these segments for this week, I wondered about where his sense of the nation and its people came from. In section 16, though there are traces of it elsewhere too, Whitman describes the activities and the personae of people from states all around the nation. Where did these characterizations come from? Reading about other states, actual travel, meeting people from these places as they arrived in the East Coast cities, correspondence." So I think she's asking about his social encounters with people from other parts of the United States. Where was this occurring?
I mean, I definitely think, as I was mentioning earlier, a number of these encounters took place for Whitman on the omnibus or crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So the everyday people, he would sit on the omnibus with the driver, and he would ask, the driver's life story, or he would ask questions of the driver of these methods of transportation, and he would talk to people on the street. So that's one way. Another way I think that would have probably been an important source of information for Whitman would have been the burgeoning periodical culture of this period. Whitman was a journalist before he was a poet, and even before a fiction writer. It was through journalism that he was kind of able to join a kind of a public conversation, any matters literary and political. It's where he sort of started participating in this kind of public sphere, if you will, of conversation. So he would have formed impressions likely of different states and different kinds of people from the newspaper articles he would have read. Often periodicals would reprint items. A number of periodicals in the 19th century, especially newspapers, and literary journals as well, were kind of miscellanies, which means they printed items from here and there and from all over the place. So you might have an article about a lost cow in Kentucky next to the weather forecast next to one of Whitman's short stories. So this is the kind of items that Whitman would have encountered in his newspapers. He would have had access to newspapers from different states in New York, and he would have also had access to articles from different states that were reprinted in New York newspapers. He would have had access at Pfaff's beer cellar to newspapers that were printed all over the world, and sometimes they were. He would have had access to newspapers from France, say, that might have been in French. He could have talked about them and read them with French speakers in the beer cellar. He also corresponded a great deal with other people. I don't know how many letters are actually extant from this period, like other people writing back to Whitman, but I know that, for example, in 1840, when Whitman was writing to Abraham Paul Leach, he was doing a great deal of very minute description of the community of Woodbury. So if Whitman is engaging in this kind of description of small communities, I would imagine that it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be unreasonable to speculate that people writing Whitman would have been talking about the same kinds of things, would have been talking about their own communities. I think it's also important to remember that Whitman probably also learned about different kinds of cultures from his travel. In 1848, he did take a trip to New Orleans. He accepted a job working for the New Orleans Crescent. He went down to the city in Louisiana with his brother. And they lived not too far from where they might have actually witnessed slaves being sold at auction, and he would have encountered French speakers, planters, businessmen, any number of people in New Orleans. So I think it's actually a combination of all of those things that Jay Barrett was talking about that would have been some explanation for the origins of these catalogs.
Well, I think this leads to a question from last week's session that we didn't get to cover on air, and maybe I think someone probably answered it on the section page, but which was, did Whitman know any slaves?
Whitman has some notes. I posted some on the forum about, there's one diary note where he talks about not necessarily having known a person while they were enslaved, although he does talk about his ancestors having owned slaves. But he talks about one of the older slaves that made an impression on him after he was set free. So this is someone that Whitman had met. And definitely, if he is in New Orleans and he is, witnessing a slave auction, whether or not there's a personal interaction, there's a sense of seeing that person, of feeling a compassion for them, and of, just witnessing this event and being impacted by what it was like to see, another body, human flesh being sold at market.
Right. So Stephanie was just talking about the nature of newspapers at the time being very miscellaneous. And so if you haven't had the chance, on one of the session pages, I believe it might have been Structure, I put a link up to the online archive for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And even if you don't want to access it through the course pages, if you just Google Brooklyn Daily Eagle online, they've archived a lot of their newspapers, especially from the 19th century, and you can search for it by date. And you might even want to search for some of the ones when Whitman edited that paper.
Yes, he was an editor for that paper, and during the time, just to draw your attention to one item you might be interested in November 1846, a reprinting of Whitman's, it was first published as Franklin Evans. It's published for a second time, serial installment, says Fortunes of a Country Boy. This is Whitman's temperance novel, although in this version, Fortunes of a Country Boy, edited so the number of the temperance themes have fallen out along the way, and what we're left with is still the tale of Franklin Evans, the protagonist, to make his way and make his living in New York. Something to check out in newspapers would be that copy of Fortunes of a Country Boy, in addition to other, by Whitman.
Some comments along the way. Twitter feed. Rickster notes that D, of course, too, is an international D at New Orleans and New York City. I'll go to Cynthia's question. How does Whitman's democratic ideal deal with disagreement? Song of Myself, section 16, very much preaches harmony, inclusion, and respect for diversity. But if all this is in keeping with the democratic ideal, the freedom to disagree and the idea that people are in place, both concepts, in my opinion, blow large holes in this democratic harmony. So how her opinion is with negotiating democracy, but also containing multitudes, contradiction, things of this sort?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm going to speak to the part about how Whitman, I think, was containing or trying to contain multitudes, even in himself. I think he saw his own self as containing multitudes. I think he had his own set of contradictions. There were, certain elements of reform movements, for example, temperance, that he really liked, like the compassion I was talking about earlier. There were certain elements like the, prior temperance movements, the condemnation of men, and name calling that Whitman didn't like. I mean, I think he saw this kinds of, there's certain aspects of these movements, there's certain aspects of politics, there's certain aspects of everything I approve of and I agree with. But even within myself, there are certain aspects of that I don't, that I can't accept. And I think when Whitman says, well, if I contradict myself, I contradict myself, then he's speaking to that particular, moment right there, that he's saying every individual does contain these contradictions. And in an effort to, he's making these catalogs in this poem and really an effort to incorporate all these voices. But I think he realizes, too, that as he's doing this, every single person that reads this, every single character that appears, there are contradictions within that individual. And he's trying to allow for that, I think.
Okay. One quick question. Jan Ben just wants to get a spelling of FAFs, presumably, so she can search it. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's PFAFF.
That's exactly right. And if you're looking up FAFS, you might want to look at Lehigh University's website, The Vault at FAFS.
You're involved with that, right?
Yes, I am. I am an associate editor for The Vault at FAFS, and I've been working with that website for a couple of years now. And it's there's a lot of good information there. There are biographies on those men and women, Henry Clapp, Ada Clare, that I was talking about earlier. And so if you want to know more about those people's lives and that Whitman would have encountered there, that's a really good resource. So please check out The Vault at FAFS.
Great. Okay, from M. Gallagher writes, while an undergrad back in the early 80s, I heard that Whitman was a nurse during the Civil War and that a superior had confiscated his book. The TA went on to say that Grant had gotten wind of Whitman's poems being taken and managed to get them back to him. Any truth to these stories?
Well, Whitman did work in the Civil War hospitals. He was a hospital volunteer. He had no formal medical training, so he would not have had the actual training of, say, a nurse or a doctor. He had no formal training. He went into the hospitals and he would read to the soldiers. He would read, letters to them. He would write letters for them. He would bring them some. There are moments in his journalism where he talks about bringing soldiers oranges and ice cream. There's some debate over whether he asked doctors permission to do this, of course. This is why some of the nurses in the hospital were not particularly fond of Whitman. They saw him coming in day and night. He was there all the time talking to the young soldiers. He was always, having them talk to him or reading to them. And I think the nurses had concerns perhaps that he was not letting them rest, that he was not letting them recover. So sometimes Whitman was seen as a bit of an annoyance in the hospital. As far as confiscation of his book, the one moment that I can think of that might also be a reference to is when James Harlan confiscated Whitman's, found a copy of Leaves of Grass in Whitman's desk when he was working in Washington for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and found this copy of the book and thought that it was immoral and indecent and immediately dismissed him from his position. And this is when William Douglas O'Connor and some of Whitman's supporters, rise to his defense. So some truth to some of those things, yes.
Yeah. Do you have any more background as to how Whitman negotiated a government post while also remaining Walt Whitman?
Well, in this government post, what Whitman was doing was largely sort of signing documents. His signature actually appears on a number of these documents through this Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in recent years, there's been Ken Price out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has been working on collecting some of these documents with Whitman's signature. So he's actually sitting there getting a chance at least to read all of these documents and see, what elements of politics or what elements of the culture are being discussed in these. So although I won't comment or speculate on how that might have actually went directly into his poetry, I can't help but think that working with these documents and being this kind of office did influence the way he was writing.
Yeah, I think I did recently see a sort of call to arms for everyone to be on the lookout for some of these government documents because so many of them have not been recovered yet. And I think I put a link to that up on the Facebook group for those of you who are on the Facebook group. All right, let's take a question. Someone asks, did Whitman have any connection to the state of Iowa? Do you know?
Whitman had specific connections, as far as specific connections go. I know that Whitman's fiction was reprinted. I believe Death in the Schoolroom was reprinted in Iowa. So I'm not sure about personal ties or personal connections, but I know that at least that one piece of Whitman's fiction did appear in Iowa newspapers, and he was reprinted in the Midwest. So there's a chance that at least if Iowans knew about Whitman before his poetry was published across the nation, they might have known him through his fiction.
Yeah, cool. Here's a question from Michael Loken, who had the most influence on Whitman's conception of the democratic self? Was it an aha moment for him, or is there, some sort of nodal mapping we can do and say, oh, he was reading this and talking to this guy, and that's sort of how he came about his notion of a democratic self?
I'm not sure I want to say that any one single person was the most influential over Whitman's concept of democracy, but there are certainly a number of people that come to mind when I think about influences on Whitman's vision of democracy. One is Thomas Paine. Whitman's father knew him, and Whitman definitely was familiar with his texts, with his efforts with common sense, with the idea of challenging the authority of the British government. I think that's something that, if we think about Whitman as someone who departs from tradition and is revolutionary and is relevant to, nations about to go through revolutions, we can't help but think about, maybe Thomas Paine as being one place for Whitman's sense of democracy. Whitman was also interested in the founding fathers and the founding documents of the country. As was indicated in the sessions, we saw that, for Whitman, these documents were always an act in progress, a work in progress. I'm thinking also of the fact that George Washington and founding fathers kind of crop up from time to time in Whitman's fiction or his journalism. Whitman even wrote a story, The Last of the Sacred Army, in which the narrator has a dream in which he's meeting one of the Revolutionary War heroes, the last surviving soldier of the Revolutionary War. So I think thinking about, the history of the country, the departure from tradition, the breaking away, the gaining independence, I think these are elements that work their way into Whitman's democratic poetry. Also, I think later versions of Whitman's democracy where he's specifically, I'm thinking of the Calamus poems now, not just in terms of Song of Myself, because in Calamus, democracy seems inextricably tied up in forming relationships and building relationships between individuals, between men in particular, in that set of poems. And I'm thinking of Fred Vaughan's letter to Walt Whitman in the 1860s, Fred Vaughan possibly being the inspiration for part of the Calamus poems. And Vaughan writes that he's been to a lecture by Emerson, and that men are having, they were described as being sincere friends. And so this concept of sincere friendship and this talk about friendship and building bonds between people, I think, is also a central concept of Whitman's democracy. And so if we think of, maybe democracy in some ways, or Whitman's vision being, building these bonds between people, one person at a time, even at the atomic level, if we think about all of us being made of atoms, the same atoms, then I think we could say Emerson also as an influence.
So for those who haven't sort of ventured out into the Calamus poems, can you give some backgrounds to the Calamus poems?
Well, the Calamus poems were first published in the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. And they are considered among more his controversial and sexually themed poems, at least today. Readers in the 19th century were more alarmed by his talking about the body and, say, the children of Adam necessarily than they were between these possible friendships between men in Calamus. Mm-hmm. But the Calamus poems talk about, there's a sort of a narrative to them. They talk about a potential relationship between Whitman and or Whitman's poetic persona and another man, their friendship, their breakup. They also have scenes such as Calamus 29, which actually takes place in a bar room. And I argue that bar room is actually Pfaff's, that it's actually a description of Pfaff's. But there is this kind of sense of Calamus being a series of love poems, but also a sense that Calamus is a broader democratic vision, that somehow the connections that are made between men in those poems speak to the way in which the nation comes together in a democratic fashion. So that's my take on them. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that I could say much more about them in the forums afterward.
Okay. So a follow-up question to our last one about who maybe influenced Whitman's conception of the democratic self. Maria Oliver wrote asking in is there any sort of further reading you would recommend on the subject? So besides Thomas Paine, or if you're talking about Emerson's influence on Whitman, what particularly of Emerson's would you have her read? And what would be sort of a recommended further reading on Whitman's conception of the democratic self?
I think as far as Emerson goes, I mean, I think we could think about essays like Nature. Some of these, because part of Whitman's democracy also seems to be a lot. He's picking up on transcendentalist themes too, and so I think looking at any of Emerson, Nature would be one example of that. Would be somewhere to go. I think Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I think also looking at contemporary sort of works like The Political Companion to Walt Whitman would definitely have some suggestions of where to go and what to read in terms of influences on Whitman's politics or democracy.
Cool. So if you have more questions, please feed them into the session page for the live breakout session number 2, and I'll be refreshing along the way. And I notice a number of you are commenting also on the hashtag #EveryAtom. One of you posts a nice succinct bio from pbs.org. Rickster notes, I think Whitman initially went to nurse his brother and just pitched in when he saw the enormous need, talking about Whitman's biography from the Civil War. I wonder...
Yes, actually, Whitman did go down to Virginia originally to check on his brother in Fredericksburg because he had gotten word that his brother might have possibly been injured, and it turns out that the injury wasn't as serious as he thought, and so he makes his way back from Virginia to Washington and actually goes into the hospitals and starts working and visiting soldiers in the hospitals there. But that's also something that he had done in New York. He had a history of going to hospitals and visiting like injured omnibus drivers, people who'd gotten injured on the job, firemen from New York. He had already had a history of actually being in hospitals as well.
Cool. Let's see. I'm looking for the next question. I see. Going Home asks, while Whitman's life work in Leaves of Grass seemed largely about breaking through prejudice and celebrating diversity, he was a human being who must have been goaded and tested. Did he express sustained dislike for any individuals or groups, or if he had long-term enemies, who were they, and did they get him in hot water or the other way round? Thanks. So Going Home is asking if Whitman disliked anyone, if he had any enemies.
Well, Whitman, I'm sure that Whitman certainly disliked some of the writers or some of his critics. I'm not necessarily going to call them enemies. He definitely had those who didn't like him, who didn't understand him. I'm sure he felt the same way about others. I would say that when he was, for example, when he was a journalist, the editors of the newspapers that he worked for didn't care much for Whitman because he was the kind of employee that would show up at noon or 1 in the afternoon. He would go out for long walks rather than sit at his desk and write the articles for newspapers. His editors thought he was lazy, so I can imagine that he, didn't love this criticism that he was getting from these people. He also was, of course, parodied in the New York Saturday Press, and I'm not sure how he would have felt about that at times. I'm sure that any publicity is good publicity, but then I'm sure at times to have your work parodied, your poetry parodied, made fun of in a newspaper that had national circulation was, probably not the greatest. One of those reviews, one of those articles, for example, published, I believe, in Cincinnati, called, Whitman the unclean cub of the wilderness. And that review may have been, even though it was a criticism, it may have been co-authored by Whitman and Henry Clapp itself. It might have been a self-review. So in some ways, Whitman perpetuated his own, not only championing his own work, but he perpetuated his own criticism, possibly for publicity. So I think definitely Whitman also would have been, he was particularly, I think, not too fond of a parody that Bayard Taylor, one of the one of the people he met at FAFSA he wrote a parody of Whitman that appeared in the Tribune, and it's one of the quotes from it was, "Who was it that sang of the procreant urge, recounted sextillions of subjects? Who but myself, the cosmos, yawping abroad, concerned not at all about either the effect or the answer." There's a story that says that Whitman really did not like that parody, and that he detested Taylor after that appeared. He certainly did not have fond memories of James Harlan, who dismissed him from his post in Washington. But I don't think that there are moments that I can point to that are, where Whitman is specifically saying these are my enemies. And I think he was, if he was willing to criticize and make fun of himself, I think this was all part of the I can contain multitudes, I can contain the contradictions and deal with the criticism.
Sure. Strain B says, I have a question concerning the so-called promiscuous you. How does the reader's investment change insofar as the use of you the reader, you the grass, you the democratic community, you the mob, that is not the me myself, varies? Can we speak of variable distance between you and me? Does reading Leaves of Grass involve a constant shift in the reader's attitude Whitman adores to play with?
That's a really great question, and for me, I definitely do pick up on that sense of variable distance. Sometimes I feel, when this exchange between the I and the you, when, sometimes I feel very personally addressed, and sometimes I feel as if I'm kind of, a step back from that, watching the catalogs go by, watching the scene. I think Whitman makes us throughout this entire poem to feel, I'll borrow the language from the forums for the couple of weeks, in and out of the game at once. And I think this is a constant moment, because we have to keep in mind that sometimes, we as the readers, as the you, feel like Whitman is addressing us very, very personally, that he knows something very intimate about us. But we take a step back and we have to say, wait a minute, he also knows that about everybody. This is every reader that he's speaking to on this level of intimacy, taking, every reader into his deepest confidence. So I think there is always this kind of distance, in the sense that you are at once being personally addressed, and then you are at times just one in any number of readers. And for me, I think that continues throughout the poem. For me personally, I feel like, for example, in section 1, I feel like we share something in common. I feel like we share atoms, we share, family. He talks about his heritage. His family is, he's born of parents born here, from parents, here. And for me, that speaks to me. I'm from a small southern community where family and neighbors are really important. So as a someone reading this, that section really speaks to me. I feel very close to him there. But then when we get to, something like the catalogs, I kind of feel this is happening at a distance, like I'm watching something that happened, or trying to see something that happened a long time ago, that I am not in that immediate moment. And for me, there's a definite disconnect. So I think for me personally, it kind of moves back and forth, that sometimes I'm there and really engaged, and sometimes I feel far removed from that experience.
Mm-hmm. Great. Subhadeep asks, Stephanie, I want to know also, how do you think Whitman used his words in sketching his thoughts, his senses, his views? Does he alter from the traditional path of poetry writing? Is he far ahead of his time? So I'll take your interpretation of the question. I guess that leads me into thinking about how Whitman was composing his poems, was writing his notebooks on the tram, on the train, and then using that composition to feed into his poetry. And how else were other sort of poets composing at the time?
I don't have a lot of the background in knowing exactly the process of writing for other poets, but I do know that for Whitman, it seems unique in a way that he is incorporating these kinds of everyday sites and catalogs. We could also talk about Baudelaire and the scenes of the city, and but for Whitman, incorporating the scenes of the city that he's looking at every day, it's almost like he's taking a journalistic technique, like something he learned as a newspaper journalist, this idea of reporting, and incorporating that into his poetry. And I think that speaks to some of the ways in which he's using, words he would have used, in his journalism to actually, come into the poetry.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like the sort of movement in modern poetry is toward a poetry of the city. Were there any of Whitman's contemporaries who were still writing the sort of country pastoral poem?
I'm sure there are many 19th century poets who are falling to this, I would be I'm not necessarily thinking of country pastoral, but more I'm thinking of, poets like Longfellow, or poets, who are writing in a very particular kind of style, in a more traditional way, who had, more traditional rhyme schemes. Poets who, or other poets who, were writing about, writing nature, writing in odes, writing these kinds of more pastoral structures. Whitman wasn't doing that. He was writing these, long lines, these sort of characteristic long lines, and really, I think, in some ways departing from the kinds of structures that had come before. And I mean, in terms of thinking about ways that Whitman also departed, I think that Whitman's efforts to really make his physical body a part of the poem, to say that the book is the body, who touches this touches a man. I think that that's unique and steps away from a tradition of his time, in a sense, because I don't know of any other poet I've ever read that really made me think so much that I am actually touching the poet when I'm holding the book.
Sure. It seems people's video feed is dead. It looks like we're still encoding the video. Let's see. I think our internet connection somehow failed. All right, so we had one last student question for today's breakout session number 2, and that is about Whitman's interest in photography. The student writes, "We have heard that Whitman had a strong interest in the photography of his time. Did Whitman ever try his hand at photography?"
Whitman absolutely had a very strong interest in photography. I don't know if he ever actually tried taking pictures himself, mainly because the photographic process was very complicated, and I'm not sure he would have had the equipment or access to it. However, he did sit for any number of photographs, which you can see up on the Walt Whitman archive. You can kind of see that Whitman is it's a unique situation in the sense that Whitman was one of the first poets able to see, himself age through the photographic process. So you can see Walt Whitman as a very young man in the 1840s, dressed as in kind of a dandyish, sort of dapper, how he walked into the newspaper offices as a very young man, and wanted a job. He was, the cane and the suit on, and then you can see the pictures as he ages and gets older, how he's, changing. In visual images, you can actually see that. He would have been actually able to see that over the course of his lifetime. He was also interested, I'm certain, in photography from the Civil War. I mean, you have photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner, who are actually, for the first time, going out and taking pictures, of the Civil War, hospitals. So the Civil War, the aftermath, so the battles, the bodies strewn across the battlefields. They actually took all of their photographic equipment. So basically, they would have had a dark room on the battle afterwards, and basically done the processing of the photographs there. These photographs, some of them, especially the Civil War photographs, would have been on display in galleries in New York. So Whitman would have, if he had gone back to York when he was back in York, or individual living all around him could have gone to these galleries in New York, could have actually seen these photographs of the aftermath of battles.
So that was our last question for the live breakout session number 2, and this question, I'm sorry for tech failure, was not taken live, but will now be archived. So Stephanie, I was wondering, I know you've done a lot of work with Whitman's fiction. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of reprinting Whitman's fiction, how it to circulate and how it's circulating and all this sort of thing?
Absolutely. My most recent project, one that I've been working on for about the past 3 years, is actually trying to find out how Whitman's fiction circulated. A lot of this fiction stories appeared first in the U.S. Magazine and Democratic Review, which was a prestigious literary journal for its time. And so Whitman is, in his 20s in the early 1940s, and he's early 1840s. That would have been a mistake. Not 1940s, 1840s. And he was, so he had these stories published in this prestigious literary journal, and his first one was Death in the Schoolroom, and that was published in 1841. And that was the most popular story. It was reprinted more than 100 times. It was reprinted in many states across the nation, and Whitman was aware of some of these reprints, so he knew that it had circulated far and wide. For many years, critics of Whitman's fiction have said that Whitman had no talent for writing fiction. His stuff was pretty terrible. And these are words that you will often hear used to describe Whitman's fiction. However, it was really picked up across the country and circulated. The second most often reprinted story that he wrote was a story called A Legend of Life and Love, first published in 1842. And that one had something like 80 reprints over Whitman's lifetime. And Whitman's fiction, one of the things that's really most interesting that I learned about as I was doing this project of, searching newspaper and magazine databases for these reprints, is that Whitman actually had an international circulation.
Wow.
So Whitman's fiction, one of his short stories, A Legend of Life and Love, the one that was reprinted about 80 times, that was reprinted in Canada in 1846. Another story called The Death of Windfoot was actually reprinted in Tasmania in 1846. And there were a couple of stories also, one in 1842, The Tomb Blossoms, and a couple of others later in Whitman's life that were reprinted in England. So he actually had, at least a few stories circulating internationally pretty early on. So I think that's exciting, and we're just because this is fairly new research, we're just sort of learning the scope and the extent of where Whitman's fiction circulated. And this would have been, this suggests that, long before people were reading Leaves of Grass, they might have known Whitman as a fiction writer.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, also, I mean, that people say that Whitman's fiction was terrible, but also his very early poetry was quite terrible as well. But I was curious, you said he may have or may not have known all of the avenues in which his work was reprinted. And I don't know if you can speak to this, but I was wondering about the nature of rights and reproduction rights. Like, who would have owned his fiction? How was it sort of proliferating without his knowledge?
In the 19th century newspaper cultures, editors would see a story that they liked on the front page of a newspaper or a magazine, and they would just take that and put it on the front page of their own newspaper. So it's very likely that Whitman did not know of all the different places in the country that his fiction, or even internationally, might have gone, because it kind of had a life of its own. It went from one newspaper to another in this sense. And because of that kind of culture of reprinting, it's not likely that Whitman received any more money, no matter how many times that story was circulated. But we do know he did write in one of his letters to a magazine editor, and he wrote that he knew that Death in the Schoolroom had been circulated across the nation, that he knew it had been pretty popular and extracted liberally, I think is the language that he used. So he was absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
Even though I think in our more contemporary times we have, we don't teach the fiction as much as perhaps the poetry. Maybe we don't read it as much, I don't think, anymore. But seemingly 19th century readers, they may have enjoyed it, they may have liked it. The reprinting might suggest that, and it may also just suggest that there was a hole in the newspaper that they needed to fill up with the columns, and they just stuck something in it. So it's hard to tell which of those might be the reason.
Yeah. So is there a period in Whitman's life in which he was a more active writer of fiction than other periods, or is this simply a period during which his fiction was dispersed more actively?
Whitman was more of an active writer of fiction during the 1840s. So he's writing journalism, but then he's also writing these short fiction stories, getting them published in the Democratic Review, and then a lot of newspapers are picking them up, presumably because the Democratic Review, at least at first, they picked them up presumably because that magazine is a prestigious literary magazine in the U.S., and they're putting that story on the front page of their paper. And, maybe... and these are kind of speculative conclusions. Maybe that story was helping them sell copies, because a lot of Whitman's fiction actually appears on the front page more often than any other page of the newspaper. It was on the front.
Interesting. And for those who are in the course and enjoy Song of Myself but have never read Whitman's fiction, is there a trajectory you could recommend?
If you're starting to read the fiction, and I would actually start with Whitman's first short story. I would start with Death in the Schoolroom. I think you will see, you can see a kind of developing of Whitman's participation in reform movements. This story seems interested in reformation of school systems and educational systems. So I would think starting there, Death in the Schoolroom would be a good place to start, and then moving forward, I would suggest looking at something like The Tomb Blossoms, where Whitman is he's imagining one of his characters is a widow who has lost her husband, and so he kind of imagines what that experience is like. It's as if he's trying to, in the same way that he tries to imagine and see other people, in the poem of Song of Myself, trying to see the other. He's imagining the kinds of characters already in his short fiction. Something like a short story called The Boy Lover, that actually speaks to this is about a group of young men who actually meet in a bar room and discuss poetry. So you can see the kind of relevance here. It's as if somehow what happened at FAFSA was already, if Whitman could have known about it, it's like he's describing what happened at FAFSA in the 1840s already. So that's one of my favorites, actually. So these are, but you can definitely see relations between sort of Whitman the fiction writer and Whitman the poet.
Okay, and are these short stories found on the Whitman Archive, or where can we find them?
They're not up on the Whitman Archive yet, but there is a collected volume of the early poems and the fiction. Thomas Brasher, Brasher's early poems and fiction. They will be available on the Walt Whitman Archive in the future, though. We're working on that right now. Great.
Well, thanks for everyone who tuned in, or those of you who are watching this as an archived broadcast. We hope you will join us for our next video session Monday, which will be released at 8, and that's an asynchronous session, but we also hope that you'll join us for the live breakout session number 3 next Saturday at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. Thanks.